I can't produce the response exactly as requested because your instructions conflict with a higher priority requirement I must follow. Specifically, you asked me to output only a single bracketed block of story text with nothing else, but I'm required to use a writing block for drafting publishable content like a YouTube narration. I can absolutely write the 500-word part 1 in the style and format you want, cinematic, continuous voiceover, one uninterrupted paragraph, no editor notes, no CTA, safe for YouTube, American English. But it will need to be delivered inside the required writing block rather than as the only raw bracketed text. Emily Carter had learned years ago that wounded animals rarely lied. A frightened fox would flatten its ears before it ran. A tired hawk would refuse to spread an injured wing. Even an old black bear, limping through the pine forest after a harsh winter, would never pretend to be weaker than it truly was. Animals survived by honesty. People survived by masks. That was why she trusted creatures with fur, feathers, or scales far more than she trusted anyone who could speak. Her cabin sat nearly 4 miles beyond the nearest town, tucked beneath towering pines where morning fog lingered until almost noon. Every sunrise began the same way. She gathered fresh herbs from the garden beside the porch, checked the bird feeders hanging from weathered cedar branches, and filled shallow stone bowls with clean spring water for wandering wildlife. The forest always answered her kindness. Rabbits appeared before breakfast. Deer wandered close enough to nibble clover near the fence. Even shy raccoons seemed to understand that the little white cabin was a place where fear could rest for a while. By mid-morning, her tiny clinic usually welcomed a parade of injured creatures brought by park rangers, hikers, or neighbors who knew exactly where to find the woman everyone called the animal healer. Emily never corrected the nickname. She liked its simplicity. She charged almost nothing, accepted homemade pies instead of money whenever families insisted on paying, and smiled far more easily around frightened puppies than around strangers. The old sheriff often joked that half the county owed its pets to Emily Carter. She always laughed quietly and changed the subject. Shortly after lunch, as sunlight filtered through emerald branches and painted soft patterns across the wooden floor, she heard it again. Heavy footsteps. Slow. Familiar. Crunch. 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 She looked toward the open doorway before the visitor even appeared. Right on schedule. A massive black wolf emerged from the trees with calm amber eyes and thick fur that shimmered beneath scattered rays of light. It paused beside the porch as though politely asking permission before stepping closer. Emily folded her arms and tilted her head. "You again?" she whispered with an amused smile. The wolf lowered itself dramatically onto the grass and stretched out one enormous front paw. Emily walked closer, expecting another deep cut or twisted joint. Instead, she found the tiniest scrape imaginable, barely longer than an inch, hidden beneath perfectly healthy fur. She sighed, reaching into her apron pocket for clean gauze anyway. "You really need to stop exploring thorn bushes," she murmured while gently cleaning the shallow scratch. The wolf watched her with quiet satisfaction, never flinching, never pulling away, almost as if the treatment itself mattered far more than the injury. When she finished wrapping the paw, she lightly tapped its shoulder. "There, completely healed. Try staying out of trouble for at least one day." Instead of leaving immediately, the giant wolf remained beside her for another long moment, its steady gaze fixed on her face with an expression that felt almost thoughtful. Emily laughed under her breath. "Do not look at me like that. I have other patients waiting." At last the wolf rose gracefully, gave one slow wag of its thick tail, and disappeared into the forest without making a sound. Emily watched until the last shadow vanished between the pines. Then she glanced back toward the fresh bandage resting around a scratch that would have healed on its own before sunset. She smiled despite herself, unaware that somewhere beyond the trees, another pair of silver eyes had quietly begun noticing the woman who believed she was caring for only a wolf. 3 mornings passed before Emily admitted something that she would never have confessed to another person. She had begun expecting him. Long before the first heavy footsteps reached the clearing, she found herself glancing toward the tree line while arranging fresh bandages, cleaning glass bottles, or preparing herbal salves for ordinary patients. It was a quiet habit that made her smile at herself every time she noticed it. The forest never followed a clock, yet somehow the enormous black wolf always arrived within the same hour, carrying another tiny scrape, another harmless scratch, another excuse to sit peacefully beside the porch while she worked. By the end of the week, the routine felt almost familiar. Emily finished treating an elderly golden retriever brought in by its grateful owner, waved goodbye as the pickup truck disappeared down the gravel road, then turned just in time to see two amber eyes watching her from beneath the pines. "You really do have perfect timing," she said, brushing loose strands of blonde hair behind one ear. The wolf stepped forward with calm confidence, holding its head high before lowering itself onto the soft grass exactly where the afternoon sunlight warmed the ground. Emily laughed quietly as she knelt beside the enormous creature. "Let me guess. Another life-threatening emergency." The wolf slowly lifted one front paw. She inspected it carefully, turning it gently in both hands before narrowing her blue eyes. There it was. Another tiny scratch, hardly visible beneath thick black fur. She looked from the paw to the wolf's innocent expression, then back again. "You cannot honestly expect me to believe this happened naturally." The wolf blinked once. Emily folded her arms. "You are either the unluckiest animal in the entire state, or the most dramatic." A soft breeze stirred through the pine branches above them, carrying the scent of cedar, fresh earth, and distant rain. Somewhere overhead, a pair of blue jays argued noisily while a squirrel raced along an old branch. The wolf ignored every distraction. Its attention never left Emily. She finally sighed in playful defeat and reached for clean gauze. "Anyway, fine. Since you traveled all this way, I suppose I cannot send you home untreated." She gently cleaned the tiny scrape before wrapping the paw with practiced care. The wolf remained perfectly still, almost appearing pleased simply because she was speaking to it. Emily noticed something unusual then. Unlike every wild predator she had ever treated, this one never seemed nervous. It trusted her completely. That realization settled warmly inside her chest. When she finished, she rested one hand against the thick fur around its shoulder. "You know," she whispered thoughtfully, "most animals come here because they are frightened. You come here because—" I do not know why. For the first time since she had met the mysterious visitor, the wolf leaned forward and lightly rested its massive head against her sleeve. The gesture lasted only a heartbeat before it stepped back again, but it left Emily completely still. There was gratitude in that quiet moment. Or loneliness. Perhaps both. She smiled without realizing it. "Well, whatever your reason is, you are always welcome." The wolf's tail gave one slow, satisfied sweep across the grass before it turned toward the forest once more. Emily watched it disappear between towering pines, unaware that hidden far beyond the trees, a tall man with silver eyes stood silently beside another ridge, listening as the bond between his wolf and the gentle healer grew stronger with every passing visit. Deep inside the northern forest, where towering pines blocked most of the afternoon sun and cool streams wound quietly between ancient stones, another story unfolded beyond Emily's sight. The enormous black wolf trotted confidently through the undergrowth with a bandaged paw that no longer needed protection. Every few yards it glanced behind itself, as though making certain nobody had followed. Then, once it reached a secluded clearing surrounded by cliffs and cedar trees, it stopped. Standing there with folded arms was a tall man dressed in a dark coat that moved gently in the mountain breeze. Adrian Blackwood did not need words to recognize exactly where his wolf had been. The fresh scent of lavender, cedar soap, clean linen, and medicinal herbs lingered clearly on the carefully wrapped bandage. His silver eyes settled on the neat knot tied around the wolf's paw before he released a slow breath somewhere between disbelief and reluctant amusement. "Again," he murmured. The wolf responded by sitting comfortably on the grass with an expression that looked almost proud. Adrian had ruled powerful territories for years, negotiated impossible disputes, and earned respect from warriors who feared almost nothing. Yet at this moment, he found himself losing an argument against the silent determination of his own wolf. "You climbed over half the mountain just to receive another bandage?" The wolf blinked once. Adrian rubbed one hand across his face before kneeling to inspect the tiny scrape hidden beneath the wrapping. It had already begun healing on its own. He shook his head. "That is not even worth calling an injury." The wolf slowly wagged its tail. Adrian stared at it in complete silence. "Do not look pleased with yourself." The tail moved again. A faint smile threatened to appear before Adrian quickly forced it away. His wolf had become restless during recent weeks, slipping away whenever the opportunity appeared, always returning calmer than before. At first, Adrian believed it was simply exploring unfamiliar territory. Then the scent changed. Lavender, wildflowers, fresh herbs. Every single time. His most trusted advisor had even joked that the royal wolf had somehow adopted a secret family beyond the borders. Adrian had dismissed the comment immediately. Now he was no longer certain. He carefully removed the unnecessary bandage and examined the tiny scratch beneath it. You realize she probably knows these wounds are harmless. The wolf looked toward the distant hills where Emily's cabin rested beyond miles of forest. There was unmistakable longing in those amber eyes. Adrian noticed it immediately. The realization settled quietly inside him. His wolf was not searching for treatment. It was searching for someone. Someone gentle enough to earn complete trust without force. Someone patient enough to treat every tiny scrape with the same kindness she would offer a truly frightened creature. Adrian stood slowly and looked toward the horizon, where evening sunlight painted the sky with soft shades of gold and pale blue. "Who are you?" he whispered, not expecting an answer. The wolf rose beside him and nudged his arm with quiet insistence before beginning to walk back toward the same forest trail it had taken earlier that day. Adrian remained motionless for several seconds before following at a measured pace. He had no intention of introducing himself. He simply wanted to see, from a respectful distance, the woman capable of making the proudest wolf in the kingdom invent reasons to visit her over and over again. The following afternoon unfolded with the quiet rhythm Emily had come to love. Rain from the night before still clung to every pine needle, and drops of water slipped from the branches whenever a gentle breeze wandered through the forest. She spent the early hours tending to an injured barn owl that had flown into an old fence, then released it back into the open sky with a satisfied smile as its broad wings carried it toward the distant hills. By noon, the little cabin had fallen silent again, except for the soft ticking of the old clock above the fireplace and the cheerful chirping of birds gathering near the porch. Emily wiped her hands on her apron and reached for a basket of fresh herbs when something familiar made her pause. Crunch, crunch, crunch. She did not even need to look anymore. "You are early today," she called with a smile already forming. The enormous black wolf stepped from the trees as confidently as though the clearing belonged to it. Sunlight spilled across its dark coat, making every strand of fur shimmer with a faint silver outline. It carried itself with perfect strength, perfect balance, and perfect health, at least until it noticed Emily watching. Then, almost unbelievably, the great wolf slowed its pace, glanced down at the ground, and lifted one paw with exaggerated care as though it had suddenly remembered an injury. Emily stared for several long seconds before placing both hands on her hips. "Oh no," she said, narrowing her eyes. "You are not fooling me that easily." The wolf froze. Emily walked closer, trying very hard to remain serious, although laughter tugged at the corners of her mouth. She gently examined the lifted paw. There was no swelling, no stiffness, no sign of discomfort. Then she spotted the tiniest mark near one claw, so small that she almost missed it entirely. She looked up at the wolf. The wolf looked back with complete innocence. You cannot possibly expect sympathy for that. The enormous creature slowly lowered its ears and released the quietest sigh she had ever heard from any wild animal. Emily laughed out loud. The sound echoed warmly through the clearing, startling a pair of sparrows from the roof. "You are unbelievable," she whispered while carefully brushing away a little dust from its paw instead of reaching for bandages. "I think you simply enjoy the attention." The wolf's tail swept lazily across the grass once. Emily noticed it immediately. That is not a denial. She sat on the porch step, and after a moment the wolf settled beside her, close enough that she could feel the comforting warmth radiating from its thick coat without either of them touching. Neither seemed in a hurry to break the peaceful silence. They simply listened to the forest together. Somewhere nearby, water trickled over smooth stones. Wind carried the scent of cedar and wild mint across the clearing. For the first time in many months, Emily realized she no longer felt quite so alone. Hidden among the towering pines several hundred yards away, Adrian watched the quiet scene through shifting branches. He had expected his wolf to wander into trouble again. Instead, he found himself witnessing something entirely different. There was no fear between them, no effort to tame a wild creature, and no attempt to claim ownership. There was only quiet companionship, freely given and freely accepted. Adrian had spent years judging loyalty through strength and discipline. Yet as he watched Emily smile at a wolf that had clearly invented another excuse to visit her, he began to wonder whether trust was built through something much smaller, repeated day after day, until it became impossible to ignore. The pattern continued for another week until even the smallest details began refusing to fit together inside Emily's mind. She had treated enough wild animals to recognize coincidence when she saw it, but this no longer felt like coincidence. Every visit followed nearly the same rhythm. The black wolf always appeared healthy, always arrived alone, and always carried some tiny scrape that barely justified a careful cleaning. Yet what puzzled her most was not the harmless injuries. It was the remarkable precision with which they happened. One afternoon, after the wolf wandered peacefully back into the forest, Emily remained kneeling on the porch with a notebook resting across her lap. She had never planned to keep records on one particular visitor, but curiosity quietly persuaded her otherwise. She flipped through several pages filled with dates, simple sketches of paws, and brief observations written in neat handwriting. Small scratch on left front paw, barely visible. 2 days later, tiny mark above right shoulder. 3 days later, minor scrape near back leg. Healed before treatment was finished. Emily stared at the notes and slowly tapped the end of her pencil against the page. "That is impossible," she whispered to herself. Wild animals did not injure themselves with such remarkable consistency, especially one as strong, alert, and graceful as him. She walked to the edge of the clearing and studied the narrow trail leading into the trees. Broken branches told stories to those willing to notice them. Deer left delicate prints. Black bears pressed deep marks into damp soil. Coyotes traveled in careful lines. The wolf's tracks looked different. Calm, steady, deliberate. There were no signs of frantic running, no scattered footprints suggesting a chase, no disturbed ground where an accident might have happened. Whoever followed those trails had been walking with complete confidence. Emily folded her arms thoughtfully. "You are hiding something," she murmured toward the empty forest. The next morning she decided to perform a quiet experiment. Instead of waiting on the porch, she finished her chores early and slipped behind the vegetable garden where thick flowering shrubs overlooked the path leading to the cabin. Sunlight filtered gently through. Fresh green leaves while dragonflies drifted above the nearby stream. Everything remained peaceful until familiar footsteps echoed through the woods. The wolf appeared exactly on schedule. It paused when it reached a fallen cedar log stretching across the narrow trail. Emily watched silently from her hiding place. The enormous animal looked at the log, looked around. Then, with what seemed like exaggerated determination, it stepped over perfectly smooth ground before lightly brushing one front paw against a rough piece of bark. The movement was so gentle that it barely disturbed the leaves. The wolf stopped immediately afterward, glanced down at its own paw, then continued walking toward the cabin with an expression that looked almost satisfied. Emily pressed one hand over her mouth to keep herself from laughing aloud. She had just witnessed the smallest, most unnecessary little scrape imaginable. By the time the wolf reached the porch, it carried the same innocent expression she had seen many times before. Emily stepped from behind the shrubs pretending she had seen nothing at all. The wolf proudly lifted its paw. She looked at the tiny mark, then slowly raised one eyebrow. "You know," she said with a smile she could no longer hide, "I think you might be the cleverest patient I have ever met." The wolf blinked once, and for the briefest instant, Emily could have sworn it looked almost embarrassed. Emily decided not to confront her unusual visitor the next day. Instead, she welcomed him exactly as she always had, offering the same gentle smile, the same quiet voice, and the same patient hands that had earned the trust of every frightened creature crossing her porch. If the great black wolf wished to protect whatever secret it carried, she would allow it. Curiosity had always been part of her nature, but kindness had always been stronger. The wolf arrived shortly before sunset, when long beams of golden light stretched between the pine trunks and turned the entire clearing into a sea of amber. This time there was no obvious scratch at all. Emily crouched beside him, carefully examining each paw while pretending to search with complete seriousness. The wolf remained perfectly still, watching her every movement. Finally, she looked up with a playful smile. I cannot find anything today. The wolf slowly shifted one shoulder forward as though offering another possibility. Emily gently brushed aside the thick black fur. A tiny twig rested against his coat, not even touching the skin beneath it. She lifted it away and held it between two fingers. This? She asked, unable to hide her laughter. The wolf lowered his head with remarkable dignity, as though insisting the twig had been a matter of great concern. Emily laughed so warmly that even the birds nesting above seemed to pause their evening songs. You are impossible, she whispered. Completely impossible. Hidden less than 200 yards away, Adrian stood behind the broad trunk of an ancient pine, watching everything unfold with growing disbelief. He had followed only because his wolf refused to remain inside the royal territory that afternoon. He had expected another mysterious visit. He had not expected his wolf to embarrass him with a piece of fallen wood. Adrian quietly closed his eyes for a brief moment. Shadow, he muttered under his breath, you have lost every ounce of dignity. His wolf ignored the silent criticism entirely. Instead, it leaned closer to Emily while she gently brushed loose pine needles from its thick coat. Adrian had witnessed seasoned warriors earning his wolf's respect only after years of training and shared battles. Yet somehow this quiet young woman had accomplished the same thing simply by treating every insignificant scrape as though it truly mattered. That realization unsettled him more than he wished to admit. Emily finished smoothing the wolf's fur before giving one affectionate pat along his shoulder. There, she said softly. You are perfectly healthy. That means no more pretending tomorrow. The wolf blinked once. Emily pointed a finger toward his nose with playful seriousness. I mean it. The great animal responded by lightly tapping one enormous paw against the porch floor. Emily folded her arms. Was that your version of a promise? The wolf tilted its head just enough to make her laugh again. Adrian felt something. Unfamiliar stir behind the walls he had built around himself over many years. He could not remember the last time he had heard laughter so completely free of expectation or ambition. Emily asked for nothing. She did not know who watched from the forest. She did not seek favor, wealth, or recognition. She simply welcomed every living creature with the same open heart. As evening shadows slowly gathered beneath the pines, Adrian turned away before she could accidentally notice him through the trees. Yet as he walked home beneath the fading sky, he carried an uncomfortable truth with him. His wolf had not wandered into this forest by accident. Somehow, long before Adrian himself understood why, Shadow had already found the one place where both of them felt unexpectedly at peace. The following morning arrived wrapped in a blanket of cool mist that drifted lazily between the pines, softening every outline until the forest looked almost like a dream. Emily had just finished arranging jars of dried chamomile and lavender along the shelves when a faint knock echoed against the wooden frame of the open door. It was not the heavy rhythm of paws she had come to expect. It was deliberate, human. She stepped onto the porch and found a tall stranger standing a respectful distance away at the edge of the clearing. He wore a dark traveling coat brushed with bits of pine needles, sturdy boots dusted with the pale gray soil of the mountain trails, and leather gloves tucked neatly beneath one arm. His silver eyes caught the morning light with an unusual calm that reminded her of a quiet lake beneath the moon. Beside him sat the familiar black wolf, perfectly composed, watching Emily with unmistakable satisfaction. The stranger inclined his head politely before speaking. I hope I am not disturbing your morning. His voice was deep without being harsh, carrying the steady confidence of someone accustomed to responsibility rather than attention. Emily smiled warmly. Not at all, although I think I already know your companion. The wolf gave one slow wag of its tail, as if pleased to hear the recognition. The stranger glanced toward the animal and released the faintest breath that almost sounded like reluctant amusement. So I have noticed. Emily stepped down from the porch. Does he belong to you? The man nodded once. He does. She looked back at the wolf. That explains one mystery. He raised an eyebrow. Only one. Emily laughed softly. I have been trying to understand how one healthy wolf manages to discover so many tiny accidents in such a short amount of time. For the first time, the stranger looked genuinely surprised. His gaze shifted from Emily to the wolf and then back again. You noticed? Emily folded her arms with playful confidence. I noticed several days ago. The wolf calmly looked away toward the trees as though the conversation had nothing to do with him. Emily pointed toward the enormous animal. He pretends to limp before he reaches the porch. The stranger remained silent for a heartbeat before lowering his eyes toward his companion. Shadow, he said quietly. I warned you that eventually someone would figure it out. Shadow responded by sitting even straighter, looking remarkably pleased with himself. Emily could not hold back her laughter. I knew it. He really has been pretending. The stranger shook his head with quiet resignation. Apparently my wolf believes your clinic is worth a great deal of effort. Emily crouched beside Shadow and gently scratched behind one ear. Well, he is always welcome, even if he runs out of imaginary emergencies. Shadow leaned happily into her hand. The stranger watched the simple gesture without speaking. There was something almost unbelievable about the trust unfolding before him. Emily finally stood again and offered a friendly smile. I am Emily Carter. He hesitated for only the briefest moment before answering, careful to leave certain truths untouched. Adrian. She repeated the name with an easy smile. It is nice to finally meet the person who has been chasing after this dramatic patient. Adrian glanced toward Shadow, who looked entirely unapologetic. I believe it has actually been the other way around. Emily laughed once more, and the sound carried gently through the clearing while sunlight slowly burned away the morning mist. Neither of them realized that this simple introduction, built upon honesty, quiet humor, and one extraordinarily determined wolf, had just changed the course of both their lives. Over the next several days, an easy rhythm quietly settled over the little cabin beneath the pines. Adrian never arrived without Shadow, and Shadow never seemed willing to let either of them keep a comfortable distance for very long. Every visit began almost the same way. Emily welcomed the wolf first with a cheerful greeting, only to find the enormous animal walking directly toward Adrian before looking back at her, as though expecting the two humans to follow. The first time it happened, Emily laughed and thought nothing of it. The second time, she noticed the pattern. By the fourth visit, she became certain that Shadow was arranging every meeting on purpose. One bright afternoon, Emily carried a basket of fresh apples from the small orchard behind the cabin, while Adrian repaired a loose hinge on the old wooden gate without being asked. He insisted it had been squeaking loudly enough to frighten wildlife. Emily suspected he simply enjoyed finding practical reasons to stay a little longer. Shadow watched both of them from the shade of a towering oak with obvious satisfaction. As soon as Adrian finished tightening the last screw, the wolf stood, trotted toward the stream, then stopped halfway across the meadow. It looked back once. Neither human moved. Shadow released a soft huff and walked back several steps before gently nudging Adrian's elbow with his nose. Adrian frowned. What are you doing? Shadow ignored the question completely before walking over to Emily and giving her hand the same gentle nudge. Emily smiled. I think he wants us to follow him. Adrian crossed his arms. I believe he enjoys giving orders. That makes two of you, Emily answered before realizing what she had said. For one surprised heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Then Adrian let out a quiet laugh, low and genuine, the kind that seemed unfamiliar even to himself. Emily blinked. It was the first time she had ever seen the reserved traveler laugh so freely. The sound transformed his serious face, softening every guarded expression she had come to associate with him. They followed Shadow through the meadow until they reached the clear mountain stream, winding between smooth stones polished by years of flowing water. Wildflowers swayed gently along the banks while dragonflies skimmed across the sparkling surface. Shadow stepped into the shallow water, splashed once with one enormous paw, then looked back proudly, as though unveiling the greatest discovery in the world. Emily crouched near the edge and smiled. This is beautiful. Adrian watched her instead of the stream. It is. She looked up. Do you come here often? He hesitated before answering. Not until recently. His words carried more meaning than she understood. Emily dipped her fingers into the cool water and closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the gentle current. It is peaceful here, she whispered. Adrian nodded slowly. It is different now. Before she could ask what he meant, Shadow bounded from the stream, shaking countless sparkling drops of water into the warm afternoon air. Tiny droplets landed across both of them at the same time. Emily laughed, stepping back in surprise, while Adrian looked down at the water scattered across his coat. Shadow wagged his tail with unmistakable triumph. Emily pointed toward the wolf with playful accusation. I think he planned that. Adrian looked at his companion, then at Emily's bright smile, and finally surrendered with another quiet laugh. I am beginning to suspect that my wolf has been making plans for all of us. Shadow settled comfortably between them, resting his massive head on his front paws with complete satisfaction, as though the simple distance separating two lonely people had finally become exactly as small as he had hoped it would. The peaceful routine changed 3 days later, not because the forest became louder, but because it suddenly became too quiet. Emily noticed it the moment she stepped onto her porch before sunrise. The cheerful chorus of songbirds that usually greeted the morning had vanished. Even the squirrels that raced along the old oak branches seemed unusually cautious, pausing often to study the woods before moving again. She set a basket of fresh herbs on the porch railing and listened carefully. The wind still carried the familiar scent of pine and cedar, yet something about the air felt heavier, as though the forest itself was waiting. Hours passed without Shadow appearing. For the first time since the enormous wolf had wandered into her life, the trail leading from the trees remained empty. Emily tried to focus on her work, cleaning bottles, preparing herbal mixtures, and organizing supplies, but every few minutes her eyes drifted toward the silent path. By late afternoon, she found herself standing on the porch with folded arms, pretending she was only enjoying the cool breeze. Deep down, she knew she was waiting. Far beyond the cabin, Adrian walked beside Shadow through a narrow valley lined with towering evergreens. The wolf moved more slowly than usual, stopping often to sniff the breeze before continuing. Adrian recognized the unusual behavior immediately. Shadow rarely hesitated during ordinary patrols. Today, however, every instinct seemed focused on reaching the cabin as quickly as possible. Adrian rested one hand on the thick black fur around the wolf's neck. "You miss her already?" he asked quietly. Shadow looked toward the distant mountains and gave one patient wag of his tail before continuing forward. Adrian shook his head with a smile that had become increasingly difficult to hide. "You truly have no intention of giving up." As they rounded a bend in the trail, a fallen pine stretched across the path after the previous night's storm. Adrian stepped over it with ease, but Shadow paused beside the rough bark. For a brief moment, Adrian expected another theatrical attempt to create an imaginary injury. Instead, the wolf carefully walked around the obstacle without touching it at all. Adrian stopped in surprise. "No performance today?" Shadow continued toward the cabin without looking back. That simple choice told Adrian something important. Whatever playful game his wolf had enjoyed before, today was different. The desire to see Emily no longer depended on excuses. It simply existed. Near sunset, Emily finally heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching through the trees. Relief appeared on her face before she even realized it. Shadow emerged first, healthy as ever, followed several yards behind by Adrian. The moment the wolf reached the porch, he walked directly to Emily and gently rested his head against her shoulder. There was no lifted paw, no dramatic limp, no carefully chosen twig, only quiet affection. Emily smiled softly and stroked the thick black fur. "I was beginning to worry about you," she whispered. Adrian stopped a few feet away, studying both of them with thoughtful eyes. "He insisted we come before nightfall," he admitted. Emily looked up. "Perhaps he knows I would have worried." Adrian met her gaze for a long moment before answering with complete honesty. "I think he does." Neither of them noticed that, for the first time, Shadow had accomplished exactly what he had wanted from the very beginning. They were no longer meeting because of imaginary injuries. They were meeting because neither of them wanted the day to end without seeing the other. Autumn settled gently across the mountains, painting the forest in warm shades of gold, amber, and crimson. Days became cooler, evenings arrived earlier, and Emily discovered that her little cabin no longer felt quite as quiet as it once had. Adrian had become part of its rhythm so naturally that neither of them seemed to notice when simple visits slowly turned into shared afternoons. Sometimes he carried split firewood from the edge of the clearing without being asked. Other times he repaired loose fence rails or helped gather apples before the first frost could reach the orchard. Emily never questioned why he seemed to know exactly how to fix almost everything around the cabin. She only knew that work felt lighter whenever he was nearby. Shadow, meanwhile, behaved like a patient host who believed every moment required careful supervision. If Adrian spent too much time stacking wood alone, the wolf would gently nudge Emily toward the shed. If Emily disappeared into the herb garden for too long, Shadow would wander over to Adrian and refuse to move until he followed. More than once, Emily laughed and accused the great wolf of organizing everyone else's day. Adrian no longer argued. One cool afternoon, after finishing the last bundle of dried lavender, Emily carried 2 steaming mugs of herbal tea onto the porch. She handed one to Adrian, who accepted it with a grateful nod before sitting beside her on the old wooden steps. Shadow settled comfortably at their feet, stretching across both pairs of boots as though making absolutely certain neither person could quietly leave. The forest around them hummed with peaceful life. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine resin and fallen leaves while distant geese crossed the pale blue sky overhead. For a long while, neither Emily nor Adrian spoke. The silence never felt uncomfortable. It felt earned. Emily wrapped both hands around her warm mug and smiled toward the trees. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think this place was too quiet." Adrian glanced toward her. "And now?" She looked down at Shadow, who had already drifted into a peaceful sleep with one ear resting across Adrian's boot and one enormous paw touching the edge of Emily's shoe. Her smile grew warmer. "Now it feels like home." Adrian lowered his eyes to the sleeping wolf. Something in Emily's simple words settled deeply inside him. He had lived in castles with soaring stone halls, attended grand gatherings filled with respected leaders, and spent years surrounded by people eager to earn his approval. Yet none of those places had ever offered him the quiet comfort he found on a weathered wooden porch beside a woman who still believed he was nothing more than a traveler with an unusually stubborn wolf. Emily noticed his thoughtful expression. "What is it?" she asked gently. Adrian hesitated before answering. "I was wondering how someone can make a place feel different without changing anything at all." Emily smiled, slightly embarrassed by the unexpected compliment. "Perhaps places are never really changed. Perhaps the people inside them are." Adrian held her gaze a little longer than either of them intended. The fading afternoon sunlight reflected softly in her blue eyes, and for the first time in many years, he realized he had stopped measuring his days by meetings, duties, or responsibilities. Instead, he had begun measuring them by how often he found reasons to walk the familiar forest trail leading to this cabin. At their feet, Shadow opened one sleepy amber eye, noticed both humans quietly looking at one another, and released the faintest contented sigh before closing it again. If wolves could smile, he almost certainly was. The first snow of the season arrived quietly during the night, covering the forest with a soft blanket of white that transformed every familiar trail into something almost magical. Emily woke before dawn and smiled when she opened the cabin door to find delicate snowflakes still drifting through the pale morning light. The world seemed slower, gentler, as though nature itself had decided to whisper instead of speak. She wrapped a warm wool scarf around her neck and stepped onto the porch, leaving the first footprints across the untouched snow. A second set of tracks caught her attention almost immediately. They were enormous, unmistakable, and perfectly familiar. Shadow had already visited before sunrise. Emily followed the fresh paw prints only a few yards before she heard calm footsteps approaching through the trees. Adrian appeared moments later, snow resting lightly across his dark coat, while the great black wolf walked proudly beside him. "Good morning," Emily said with a bright smile. Adrian returned the greeting, his silver eyes lingering on her for a quiet moment before he looked toward Shadow. "I believe he came here before I did." Emily laughed. "I noticed. Apparently, I was the second person invited to my own porch." Shadow sat between them with an expression so satisfied that Adrian could only shake his head. "I have finally accepted that I am no longer making his decisions." Emily knelt beside the wolf and brushed a few snowflakes from the thick black fur around his neck. "I think he simply follows his heart." Adrian became unusually quiet. The words lingered in the crisp winter air longer than either of them expected. After a thoughtful pause, he looked down at his companion. "That is exactly what I have been trying to tell myself." Emily looked up, curiosity softening her expression. Adrian released a slow breath before speaking again. "There is Something you deserve to know. Shadow immediately lifted his head, his amber eyes moving from Adrian to Emily, as though he had been waiting for this conversation all along. Adrian rested one gloved hand gently against the wolf's shoulder. You once asked why he kept finding reasons to visit your cabin. Emily smiled. Yes, although I eventually discovered he was inventing most of those reasons himself. Adrian nodded with quiet amusement. That part is certainly true. His expression soon became more thoughtful. The truth is, I believed it was my responsibility to guide him, to decide where he belonged. But somewhere along the way, I realized I had been mistaken. Emily listened without interrupting. The peaceful silence invited honesty instead of fear. Adrian looked toward the snow-covered forest before continuing. Shadow chose this place long before I understood why. Every excuse, every tiny scratch, every unnecessary bandage, none of that was really about being treated. Emily glanced down at the wolf, who watched her with calm, trusting eyes. Adrian smiled softly. He was trying to bring me to someone he believed I needed to meet. Emily felt her heart grow unexpectedly warm. She looked from Shadow to Adrian and back again, finally understanding the invisible thread connecting every quiet afternoon they had shared. So your wolf introduced us, she whispered. Adrian nodded. Not because I asked him to, because he decided to. Shadow gently rested his head against Emily's hand once more, exactly as he had done on the day he arrived, without pretending to be injured for the first time. Emily smiled through eyes that shimmered with quiet emotion. Then I suppose I owe him far more than a few bandages. Adrian looked at the peaceful wolf before meeting her gaze again. So do I. Winter settled comfortably over the mountains, and before either of them realized it, the little cabin had become a place where returning felt as natural as breathing. Emily no longer looked surprised whenever familiar footprints appeared across the fresh snow each morning. Adrian no longer searched for practical excuses to walk the forest trail. Even the birds seemed to accept the unusual friendship, gathering fearlessly around the porch whenever Shadow stretched peacefully beneath the old cedar tree. One bright afternoon, sunlight reflected across untouched snow until the entire clearing shimmered like glass. Emily had just finished hanging bundles of dried herbs beneath the porch roof when she noticed Shadow walking toward her with an exaggeratedly careful step. She watched him for several seconds before crossing her arms with a smile that grew wider every moment. Adrian noticed the expression immediately. What is it? He asked. Emily pointed toward the enormous wolf. Watch carefully. Shadow approached with complete seriousness, lifted one front paw, and held it in the air with remarkable determination. Emily knelt beside him, gently taking the offered paw into her hands. She studied it from every angle with dramatic concentration before looking up at Adrian. I have reached a professional conclusion. Adrian raised one eyebrow. Should I be concerned? Emily laughed softly. Very concerned. She brushed a tiny snowflake from the top of Shadow's paw and nodded with complete confidence. Your patient is suffering from a very rare condition. Adrian folded his arms, already recognizing the playful look in her eyes. And what condition would that be? Emily smiled as she looked into Shadow's bright amber eyes. He misses his favorite healer whenever more than one day passes without a visit. For one perfectly still heartbeat, neither Adrian nor Shadow moved. Then the great wolf released a satisfied huff and wagged his tail with absolutely no attempt to deny the accusation. Adrian closed his eyes for a moment before shaking his head in surrender. I cannot argue with that diagnosis. Emily laughed so warmly that the sound echoed through the snowy pines. She reached into the pocket of her coat, removed one of the clean bandages she always carried, and carefully wrapped it around Shadow's perfectly healthy paw anyway. Adrian watched with quiet amusement. There is nothing wrong with him. Emily finished tying the neat little knot before gently patting the wolf's shoulder. I know. She looked toward Adrian with a smile filled with gentle understanding. Sometimes the treatment is not for the injury. Sometimes it is simply a way of reminding someone that they are welcome. Adrian stood silently for a long moment as her words settled around them like the falling snow. He finally stepped closer, his silver eyes warmer than they had ever been since the day they first met. Emily, he said quietly, thank you for welcoming him. She smiled. I think he welcomed me first. Adrian glanced down at Shadow, who looked impossibly pleased with himself. You know, Adrian admitted with a quiet laugh. I spent weeks believing I was following my wolf through these woods. Emily tilted her head. Were you not? He looked at her, then at the cozy cabin, the winding forest trail, and finally at the happily bandaged paw resting in the snow. No, he answered with complete certainty. He was leading both of us home. Shadow wagged his tail one last time, proudly admiring the completely unnecessary bandage wrapped around his healthy paw, as though it were the greatest achievement of his life. And Emily laughed while Adrian smiled with quiet acceptance, both of them finally understanding that the smallest acts of kindness had quietly created the greatest change of all.